Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. The federal government is reiterating its desire to help Indigenous people and to make right with things through truth and reconciliation. And they had a press conference yesterday where they provide update on the support for Indigenous communities. But the big question is, what have they actually really done? Are they just announcing a press conference just so that the issue stays in front of the public and the people know that they are actively trying to work on it? It's a big question because a lot hasn't changed yet. There's still the question of the missing names of the children who were lost at the residential schools. There's still the question of what's going to be done about the clean water in many of Indigenous reserves, where the communities are still under boil water advisories, some of them leading back to the 90s, where we also heard a court decision where people aren't going to be able to go back more than 6 years into the history of the community to ask for damages and monetary aid. There's a lot left to be said that they're trying to give a progress report. So what is the progress that they're actually reporting on, and what is moving forward? There was a delegation from Kamloops that went to the Vatican and came back with the Pope going to be coming this summer to offer an official apology from the church. So is there really a measurable progress being made towards Indigenous communities and the help that the federal ministers are talking about? So let's listen to what the federal ministers actually have to say, what they're reporting on, and listen with open ears so we try to understand the purpose of making announcements.
Pleasure it is to welcome the Mayor of Regina, Sandra to this office, an opportunity for us to talk about the work we've been doing together on infrastructure, on water, on reconciliation, on so many different things. Obviously, as a member of the Big City Mayors Caucus, we had a great meeting a number of months ago, but there's always more to do, and it's a real delight to be able to welcome you here to Ottawa. I know you had constructive and productive meetings with a number of our ministers, but I'm really glad that we get a chance to connect as well. Quel plaisir d'accueillir la mairesse de Regina pour une rencontre, pour parler de ses priorités et du travail que nous allons faire ensemble, tous les différents paliers de gouvernement pour livrer pour les Canadiens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. In terms of the assistance of the federal government, it's everything from our water treatment plant, infrastructure development, pre-engineering design for relocation along the National Trade Corridor, Reaching Home initiative. We've got some work going on with community safety and well-being, and further infrastructure work needed as we in Regina come back from the recovery and from the pandemic. But economic growth, of course, is enormously important to our community.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Bonjour tout le monde. Sorry for being late. I just wanted to get this meeting off in a good way and ask Elder McGregor to open things up for us. Thank you.
Good afternoon and good morning, depending on which part of the country you're in Turtle Island, and for the Tri-Coast or the three areas of known as Turtle Island. I was requested to come in and assist for the residential school community announcements. So I would say Quaker Kanai, Fred Cobonishan, McGregor and Indigenous cause in Omar Mune and the key in Nondana key in Gitaganzibing in Donjaba. And I'd just like to say before I start here is I would just like to say Kwe, Tanse, Nani Bojo, Wache, and Sego. And those are neighbors and language families within the history of Canada and territorial areas. And I'd also like to welcome everybody to unceded Algonquin territory, which you are all familiar with and all your kids are. Your kids have been privileged, but this one, for the residential school children, they are but a memory. And this is where we try to assist this process. So I'll start with the real general acknowledgements. I was going to say, J'aime do no in good tongue she be good on Jane Ongum. No in good tongue she be good. King guys it again. No in good tongue she be cockana king guys it again. Kai to an oshma cockanagach job to toy on oshmagach. Guy take can't you go guy take king can done. No in good to me good king guy toy on oshma cockanagach and J to be keys this an unkshuk. She's been months in Kakanagach, Gingai, Toy, and Oshama, King, the way and gets Jimmy Gretch. Jimmy Gretch on Jay, Neil Gardejik, Nijo Gardejik, Madigajik, Masujik. The way and gets Jimmy Gretch called me Shang Oshama, gets been Madzuin. Me Gretch on Jay, Tewe, Ganesh, Jupar, Ganesh, because also don't know why can Margos when on Jay, Tewe, Ganesh, Jupar. Me Gretch on Jay gets him Nanik. Kingai tonka kakanago josh mami I metegok be saiganan. The way in which Jimmy Gretch Keen on J Mashkikino Jamaki Kai Toyan. In Abigis, Gidai Nagijik Ayabanoji Shaki and a Gazajik kind of going residential Kamadnani. I said, Jikwe, what KV in a while. You can't on all luggage. I know it, which to me, which King guys, Chigay and Oshmark, which Ginagaji, Kanabukajik. Conway Kayanagaz, Jig Conway, and Con Wiesen the Sikh. Nagachiega K. Quay, Wagashi Jabanonji, Shak, me God nodding, and I was a Akuzu and Ojama. Kakanagishki guys again, and Kami Shangos Monway and Gutch Regretch. I Kanigan is Jagoch Marguch, K. Gogi, Windama, Goguch on J. I. Abnoji, Shagai in Kajin Kai, the residential school. No, Gutch. Chimigwech, Gazinji. And it's just a quick acknowledgement for all that is provided and all that the teachings have been provided here in order for every one of us to continue living. And for all of those that are living through this pandemic, and for the war-torn areas, and for the children that didn't make it back, and that we hear in the media as to what's happening. We have, what I understand, what I have been told, is that there is an announcement here by the ministers responsible. So I would just ask everyone to listen up. It's very important because this is part of Canadian history in a pandemic, in a war that's occurring overseas, and all that's happening. But I ask that we continue, that all that is provided, that we acknowledge that. Miigwech.
Hello, bonjour. I want to first thank Elder McGregor for starting us off in a good way, highlighting that we are gathered here today on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. J'aimerais vous remercier d'être ici. Aujourd'hui, ça a plutôt la nature d'une mise à jour quant au soutien de notre gouvernement aux communautés qui tentent de faire face aux séquelles des pensionnats et travailler vers la guérison et la fermeture. Ce travail relève forcément de plusieurs ministères fédéraux. Je suis heureux d'être accompagné, notamment aujourd'hui, de ma collègue, l'honorable Patty Hajdu, ministre des Services aux Autochtones, et le ministre David Lametti, ministre de la Justice et procureur général du Canada. Il y a presque un an, Kamloops Tessahwapim annonçait que les disparus avaient été retrouvés sur les lieux de l'ancien pensionnat de Kamloops. For Indigenous people across the country, it was no surprise, indeed a confirmation, that this is a reality that they've always lived with for many generations. Since the first announcement, many other communities have come forward with possible findings of missing children. The numbers to date, a number of which are presented here on screen, are well beyond what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission associated with each of these institutions. En tant que pays, nous avons collectivement rejoint les peuples autochtones en deuil. En tant que pays, nous avons juré de faire mieux. Le Canada a une obligation donc morale envers les survivants de rechercher la vérité et de les soutenir, de les appuyer dans leur cheminement vers la guérison. The reports of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and before that, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, brought the experiences of survivors and children who never returned home to national attention. Since then, implementing the calls to action has been a vital part of Canada's work to advance reconciliation. And while our government has taken steps on the path to reconciliation, it's been too slow. And while the report in the United States, released last week by the United States Department of the Interior, reminds us all that this issue is far greater than the devastation that occurred in Canada. It's another reminder that we have to accelerate the pace here in Canada. More recently, The Department of Crown Indigenous Relations has been supporting communities specifically through a particular fund called the Residential School Missing Children's Community Support Fund Programming. À ce jour, 78,3 millions de dollars de ce financement ont été versés à des communautés autochtones à travers le pays, soutenant plus de 70 initiatives de recherche, de collecte de connaissances, de commémoration, de mémorisation et d'enquête sur les sites des anciens pensionnats. For instance, Eskedem First Nation in British Columbia is undertaking initiatives to honor children lost at the Caribou and Kamloops residential schools. Now Eskedem is working with the Caribou Chilcotin Teachers Association to provide opportunities for survivors to come into local schools and share their culture, traditions, and residential school experiences with students and staff. De l'autre côté du pays, la Première Nation Shubenacadie en Nouvelle-Écosse a lancé un projet de soutien aux pensionnats de Shubenacadie qui prévoit des recherches locales et la collecte de connaissances auprès des aînés, ainsi que des enquêtes sur les lieux entourant l'ancien pensionnat. La communauté, entre autres, installera également une plaque en l'honneur des enfants disparus. The Survivors Secretariat at Six Nations of the Grand River in Ontario is undertaking work at the former Mohawk Institute Residential School. They're coordinating with survivors and 18 different communities to search more than 430 acres of land to locate, document, map, maintain, commemorate unmarked burials. This was one of the largest institutions, and their work is far-reaching. Consistent with calls to action 72 through 76, it's clear that communities know what they need to do to move forward, to best respond to their individual needs, and Canada needs to be there to listen. We'll make sure that the work ahead addresses the needs and wishes of survivors, families, and communities, and makes a tangible impact. Les nouveaux investissements prévus dans le budget fédéral cette année nous aideront à surmonter les conséquences honteuses des pensionnats et du colonialisme et aller de l'avant en partenariat avec les peuples autochtones. In budget 2022, the government allocated an additional $122 million specifically to support the Residential School Missing Children's Fund, so that more communities can begin initiatives at their pace in locating and commemorating burial sites. This brings the government's total investment across departments to well over $500 million for implementing those particular calls to action. And to ensure communities have a trusted source of advice on locating burial sites, work is now underway to establish a national advisory board on residential schools missing children and unmarked burials with knowledge keepers and experts. This committee will provide expertise to communities and groups who are working through this very, very painful process of locating and documenting burial sites at the former residential schools. Alors que les communautés commencent à se rétablir, il est important, même crucial, de s'assurer que les séquelles des pensionnats ne seront jamais oubliées. To honor survivors and all the missing children, our government is committed to building a residential schools national monument in Ottawa. A newly formed survivor-led steering committee will guide this work, which will provide Indigenous peoples and all people in Canada with a place where people can gather to express grief, heal, learn, and gather their thoughts. Budget 2022 as well invests $25 million over 3 years to Parks Canada to support the commemoration of former residential school sites, as commemoration is a shared responsibility. The funding will also build on the 2020 designation of the residential school system as a national historic event and the designation of 4 former residential schools as national historic sites. To advance these efforts, Budget 2022 will dedicate $25 million over 3 years to Library and Archives Canada to support the digitization of millions of documents relating to the Federal Indian Day School system, and this will ensure that survivors and all Canadians have a meaningful access to them, as access to relevant information is critical to uncovering the truth. Ensemble, nous assurons que les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis sont soutenus dans leur quête de la vérité et dans le processus connexe de la guérison. It's why, as well, in Budget 2022, we've invested $5.1 billion over 5 years to Public Safety Canada to ensure the Royal Canadian Mounted Police can support community-led responses in unmarked burial sites, something communities have asked us to do. Nous savons ça va prendre du temps pour reconstruire des décennies, des siècles de confiance perdue. Ce travail est réalisé en collaboration étroite avec les peuples et les communautés autochtones elles-mêmes, car nous nous engageons à être des alliés pour le changement et des partenaires pour l'inclusion. Indigenous people know best how to undertake this work in a culturally and sensitive, respectful way. We have to respect that pace and those demands. And we know that reconciliation doesn't come easily, but we remain committed to making further progress by addressing the past wrongs and the current impacts that are still felt today. I'll now pass the word over to Minister Patty Hajdu. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, and thank you so much, Elder McGregor, for opening today's event and for reminding us that even with the many global crises that our world faces, the impact of colonization is an ongoing crisis for Indigenous peoples. It's an honor to be with you here today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and I come from the area of the Robinson Superior Treaty closest to Fort William First Nation. Since the first identification of unmarked burials by Tecumlip's Tsawitmuk nearly 1 year ago, First Nations, Inuit and Métis survivors' families and communities have shown incredible strength as wounds and grief and loss were reignited. This confirmation of unmarked burials and all the others since has been yet another painful and traumatic reminder of the legacy of colonization and the effect of residential schools on families and communities. I thank the many people over the years who have shared their most incredibly personal and moving stories with me. And although these personal and family devastations are hard to hear, to heal, we must all listen. And together, we all must do everything we can to support survivors, families, and communities as they respond to and work through the intergenerational trauma and the ongoing impact that residential schools has left. Our government is an active partner in supporting community, family, and personal healing. Indigenous Services Canada is working with communities to manage former residential school buildings and to ensure mental health and wellness supports are available to all those who need them. Although the last residential school closed in 1997, many of the buildings still stand, and they serve as a permanent reminder of the pain and trauma that so many survivors experienced in those institutions. Some communities would like to see them gone, and on the sites where they once stood restored, other communities continue to use the buildings and would like to help renew and renovate them. To address the colonial legacy of these buildings, Canada has committed more than $100 million to support community plans for building demolition, land remediation, and construction or renovations, so that communities can lead the development of new spaces for healing, commemoration, and sharing culture. As of this spring, Indigenous Services Canada has begun consultations with all First Nations who had a former residential school on reserve to determine the wishes of that community. In Lac Seul, we're supporting enhanced delivery of mental health services so that people can access the help they need as they heal. In Northern Ontario, we've invested in culture-based learning for Indigenous and intergenerational survivors with a focus on reclamation and reconciliation conducted by elders. These are just a couple examples of the work that's happening across the country. The schools are a physical reminder of deep mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual scars that survivors, their families, and all those affected carry and have often passed on to the descendants through intergenerational trauma. Indigenous youth continue to carry the traumas of past generations caused by Canada's institutions. These health supports are vital to ensure These resilient youth have access to the necessary cultural supports and spaces. They are the next generation, and they are leading the path forward. And we must ensure all Indigenous peoples and communities can thrive and prosper in this country. To support mental health and overall well-being, through Budget 2021, the government renewed funding of $107.3 million per year for 3 years for trauma-informed, culturally appropriate, and Indigenous-led mental wellness services. Responding to the location of unmarked burials, a further investment of an additional $107.3 million was announced in August 2021 for expanded access of trauma-informed health supports for people and communities most impacted by the legacy of Indian residential schools. This funding was provided directly to Indigenous communities and organizations to bolster the existing network of trauma-informed health and cultural supports across the country, including in urban areas. Building on this, Budget 2022 provides a new 2-year investment of $227.6 million to support Indigenous mental wellness services. Part of this recent funding goes towards maintaining the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line, which gives survivors and their families access to immediate support and crisis intervention services 24 hours a day. Indigenous peoples can also access the Hope for Wellness helpline, which provides immediate toll-free telephone and online support and crisis intervention 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can chat with a counselor by phone at 1-855-242-3310 or through the website at hopeforwellness.ca. As more remains are found and more truth is uncovered, there will be need for more supports and healing that is culturally safe and designed by Indigenous peoples. Indigenous services and the Government of Canada remain committed to supporting communities in every way as they work towards healing from the tragedy and ongoing impacts of residential schools. Miigwech, Kuyanamik, Merci, thank you, merci. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Minister Lametti.
Thank you, Patty. Bonjour, hello, kwai ulokut, tansi, sego, wacha. J'aimerais commencer par reconnaître que, comme nous tous, nous sommes rassemblés aujourd'hui sur les territoires traditionnels de la nation Algonquin-Anishinaabe. Pleased to be able to join my colleagues, Ministers Hajdu and Miller today, and I want to thank Fred McGregor for getting us started in a good way. Last month, I visited the site of the former St. Joseph's Mission Residential School in Williams Lake. It was incredibly powerful to stand on this land, to see the buildings where tragic, barbaric events took place. I felt the enormous weight of our colonial past, along with the responsibility, the heavy responsibility to keep moving forward, to keep working on making things right. The depth of healing that is needed in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, and in Canada more broadly, is overwhelming. To make meaningful progress, we must acknowledge the truth about this country's history. A year has passed since the first news emerged from Tk'emlúps Secwepemc First Nation. We continue to grieve. Since then, many sites have been identified across Canada, and searches continue. En réponse à ces tristes découvertes, je me suis engagé à trouver de nouveaux outils légaux pour composer avec ces enjeux complexes. Nous avons annoncé notre intention de nommer un interlocuteur spécial indépendant qui travaillera avec les gouvernements des Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis, ainsi qu'avec les organisations, les communautés et les familles autochtones. Parmi les responsabilités de l'interlocuteur spécial, conseiller le gouvernement sur un nouveau cadeau législatif assurant le traitement respectueux et culturellement approprié des sépultures.
Nous ne pouvons pas changer le passé, ni faire disparaître le poids des lourds traumatismes intergénérationnels qui portent les peuples autochtones. Mais nous pouvons agir pour alléger leur fardeau. Over the past year, we have held extensive engagement with communities directly affected, as well as with Indigenous leadership. The work has helped inform the mandate of this role and has helped to identify potential candidates. We are now getting close to an appointment, and there will be news to share very soon. I can assure you that our government is wholly committed to supporting Indigenous communities in the healing process. Budget 2022 committed $10.4 million over 2 years to support the work of the special interlocutor. I look forward to seeing that work begin. We cannot change what happened or undo the intergenerational harms that still haunt survivors and families. But we can be a part of the transformation that helps dismantle the colonial and racist policies, practices, and systems that continue to exist today. I believe that a critical piece in that transformation is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Parliament passed it last June. The Act provides a roadmap for implementation of the Declaration at the federal level, and it's a critical step towards recognizing, promoting, protecting, and upholding the human rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. The Act's value and importance will be evident long after we have exited the political stage. Budget 2022 also proposes a significant investment towards the implementation of the UNDA. It includes $65.8 million over 5 years, starting this fiscal year, and $11 million ongoing. Nous avons également répondu à l'action à l'appel 50 de la Commission Vérité et Réconciliation, appuyer la revitalisation des traditions judiciaires autochtones. Nous reconnaissons le rôle primordial des communautés autochtones pour le développement, l'usage et la compréhension des lois autochtones. Nous concentrons aussi nos efforts pour améliorer l'accès à la justice des peuples autochtones, ce qui passe par la lutte contre la discrimination systémique et la surreprésentation des Autochtones dans le système de justice. We are doing that through law reform and important program investments, such as expanding the application of Gladue principles in the criminal justice system and increasing the number of Indigenous justice centres and the services they provide. These initiatives challenge us both to act and to acknowledge the truth. Together, we will keep pursuing a better path to justice based on respect, dignity, equity, and trust. Merci, thank you, Magwitch, Nakramik, merci, Niawa, Chinskumatin.
Okay, we'll now be taking some questions from the media. So we're going to start with the room first. It's going to be one question, one follow-up. Please line up at the mic and state your name clearly. Thank you.
Afternoon. Kevin Gallagher with CTV National News. I suppose my question is for Minister Miller. As we approach the 1-year anniversary of the discovery of unmarked graves in Kamloops, how far along is the process in terms of the scope that this could get to? And really, I think the question I really want to ask is, you know, for family members that are looking for closure, there's still a debate as to whether certain grave sites could be exhumed, what type of criminal investigation there could be, and when there may be identifications for family members to know what happened. Is there anything you can give us in terms of an update on that process? Is that closer at all?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Kevin, and I'll do my best to give you an equally good answer. The reality is, and we certainly heard it, for example, from Williams Lake, a few weeks ago is this could be a 10-year process. Communities like Kamloops, Williams Lake, a handful of others have put years, and in fact, fighting against the federal government, putting into place protocols and scratching together money to try and get some answers, because this is about closure and, at the end of the day, accountability and healing. Not trusting the federal government, not getting financial supports have been huge barriers for them, and most importantly, survivors in getting the truth. What we see in communities like Kamloops, like Williams Lake and others, is a very, very sophisticated set of protocols as to how they engage their own community members, perhaps the dozens of other communities that have had members, children taken from them and never returned home, in some very, very sensitive steps. And you named one of them. The most painful one would ultimately be exhumation and testing of DNA. Those are discussions that I would encourage you to have directly with the communities, but if I can speak, and I hesitate for them, a lot of them are at a point of deciding what is that next step, and it takes a lot of consultation within the communities. You can't just ask the RCMP to storm in, knowing the painful history that they have with enforcement, and specifically the RCMP, and you can't just decide that from Ottawa. It has to be a community-led process, and the community discussions are multifaceted. We shouldn't expect anything otherwise, but they are looking at that next step, and we'll have to customize our response and our federal response and the work that we do in this case with British Columbia to make sure that we're not standing as an impediment for them to get answers. That means doing work on supports for DNA testing, doing work with archives and getting more information as to what those residential school narratives are. And as the TRC report painfully said, it may be that the full truth will never be understood given the scope and depth of destruction of documents and the passage of time. But we can't let that be an excuse for the work that we do and continue to work with. We certainly have our work with the federal government to support communities. So there's a tendency to talk a lot about radar searches. They're important, but they are a very small portion of a process of triangulation and getting to the truths. Survivor interviews and getting survivors, some of whom are speaking out for the first time, to spend days at times with guides to get a level of information where they can actually triangulate sites, and then that next step of exhuming and sometimes even repatriating. But I would say a lot of the communities aren't there yet, but they're getting very, very close to that next step, and we'll be with them.
I'll just follow up. When you say that it could be a 10-year process, what does that entail? Is that what you think it will take to uncover many of these truths and painful truths, as you call them? Is that what Canadians and First Nations should prepare for? A 10-year odyssey to get to some of the core of what happened here?
Look, I don't want to generalize. I don't think I think most of us aren't really prepared for what that truth ultimately will reveal as a country. We're really at the tip of the iceberg in terms of discoveries. They are very notable and very painful. But we're talking about an upwards of 140 potential former residential school sites. Now, not all of them operated for 150 years. Some of them operated for a very short period of time. But we've got sites and searches related to 70 investments to a lower number of schools. But this is very much the tip of the iceberg in terms of getting to the bottom of things, and it's something that we'll have to do with communities. That 10-year number is something that Williams Lake told me. It could be longer. I would expect a lot of communities would demand that to be a shorter period of time, but we need this government to be there every step of the way for investments over that period of time. while some communities want answers yesterday, there are others that don't want to be rushed into things, and it's sort of painful to have a conversation, particularly in and around an election, where a community says, well, is that money going to run out with the next government comes in and there's not going to support us in the way we've been in the past? And that's what communities have to face with time in and time out with the federal government. We have to acknowledge that and know that if you're not ready, take your time, but if you're ready, we'll be there for you.
I have a question for Minister Lametti. Thanks, Minister. Stephanie Taylor with the Canadian Press. Will the government adopt the model for a miscarriages of justice commission recommended by the panel that you appointed?
Thank you, Stephanie, for that question. As you know, this is something that's very close to my heart. In fact, I succeeded in getting that commission into my mandate letter, and so it's critically important to me. Every single commission, every single inquiry that's been done into wrongfully convicted in Canada has recommended this kind of commission. And so I'm moving forward with it. You know that I have received a report from former Justices Harry Laforme and Juanita Westmoreland Traoré about the potential architecture, if you will, for this kind of commission. We're studying that right now, looking at the various alternatives that are presented in that report. But I can assure you that excuse me for getting emotional. I can assure you that this will happen. David Milgaard died yesterday. I was profoundly saddened by the fact that he would not live to see this. I'd spoken with David and I assured him this would happen. I wish his mother were still here too. She died in 2020. I can assure you this will happen and we're moving forward.
If I can, I kind of have two follow-up questions. And one, first, can you speak to any kind of a timeline? You mentioned that you are disappointed, but what kind of timeline can Canadians expect beyond when it comes to you making a decision from what you're studying? As well, a new report released today says a new approach to the conviction review process needs to deal with the realities of racism, class bias, and misogyny experienced by Indigenous women that lead to miscarriages of justice. Will this new body be addressing this?
The short answer to that second question is yes, and that's certainly why we took care in appointing the two former judges that we appointed, so that they would be able to share that lived experience. It's certainly one of the things that comes through again and again in looking at these kinds of cases. So yes, we will find a way for the Commission to make sure that it can deal with those kinds of frankly tragic experiences and the systemic racism and injustice that's sadly part of the system that we're trying to correct. And indeed, adding this kind of commission is one way of fighting systemic racism and systemic inequality in our criminal justice system. In terms of timeline, it's critical to get this right. There are some models out there in other jurisdictions that the justices looked at in their report, but there's a lot there. There's a lot there with respect to what we might do and how it would fit in to our system. So I can't give an absolute timeline, but I can say I want to get this done before the end of my mandate.
Fraser, APTN National News. This is also for Minister Lametti. Can you give me a bit of a sort of an outline of what sort of powers the special interlocutor will have and what they'll do exactly?
There are a number of different things in the mandate, which, as I mentioned in my speech, was developed in conjunction with Indigenous leadership in Canada, both at the community level, a number of the communities affected to the extent that we knew them, as well as national Indigenous leadership organizations. The primary goal is to build trust. The primary goal of this person is to be a go-between between communities, between families, between levels of government, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and as well, the person is not an investigator. The investigations are the domain of the police and often the RCMP. Prosecution is domain of prosecutors. But hopefully this person will also be able to facilitate channels of communication there too without actually interfering or impeding any kind of investigation. We have asked specifically that this person try to identify any legal lacuna that might exist in our normative structures so that we can remedy that, so we can better deal with questions of residential grave sites at former residential schools as we move forward. But the person is basically going to be a go-between with the advisory committee that Minister Miller mentioned, and as I said, with all levels of government. So the person is going to be a facilitator. Hopefully will have sufficient weight or gravitas to throw around for what economists call moral suasion, and really just to try to rebuild that trust that has been so often lacking in our system.
Yeah, so based on that, I'm just wondering, with so much mistrust out there, I guess, of both government and sort of the residential school system done by both churches, why not, take it one step further and invite somebody from the United Nations to observe as an independent observer and file a report?
This doesn't preclude any United Nations investigation. That's within their bailiwick, and so in fact this if anything helps to create that kind of dialogue. But the most important part of my answer to your question is that this is a suggestion that came from Indigenous peoples themselves, in particular from British Columbia at the outset, and so we were very much reacting to what was a very good suggestion based on the structures of systems we currently have. If there are gaps in those systems, this person might be in a position, and in fact we've specifically asked that they help to try to identify those gaps such that we can try to correct them.
All right, thank you. Now we're going to go to the teleconference line. So Patrick, I think we have someone up first.
Thank you. You may press star 1 at this time if you have a question. First question is from Stephen Huff from CBC News. Please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes. Yes.
Hello? Okay. So this is a question for Minister Hajdu. The Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Alberta is releasing its preliminary findings of its investigation into Blue Quill's residential schools tomorrow, and a spokesperson said it would be a triggering and traumatic event. The communique says federal funding that was available was allocated to an agency that Saddle Lake is not a treaty signatory to, so it couldn't get the money. What will you do in response?
So I think that's for Minister Hajdu, but the question was unclear on the line. Stephen, can you repeat it again, please?
Sure. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, maybe a little slower.
Okay. Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Alberta is releasing its preliminary findings of its investigation into the Blue Quills residential school tomorrow. And a spokesperson has said it is going to be a triggering and traumatic event. That community says the federal funding that was available was allocated to an agency that Saddle Lake is not a treaty signatory to, so it couldn't get the money. What are you planning to do in response?
And who was your question for?
It was for Minister Hajdu.
Okay. I think we're having some issues hearing, right? Yeah, sorry, we're having some issues with the line. I think we're having some connectivity issues. Just give me 1 minute and I'll see what I can do.
Take your time. Is this any better?
It is better. Can you say, like, test 1, 2, say a sentence?
Test 1, 2, 3, Stephen Hoff, CBC News.
I don't know, Minister Miller, Lametti, do you understand? Yeah, we'll get back to you, Stephen. Sorry.
Okay,
Allison
no
will give you a call. Operator, let's go to the next question.
Certainly. The next question is from Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead.
Hi, Ministers. You announced on August 10th that there would be a special interlocutor on Indian residential schools. It's been 9 months since then, so can you please explain what's taking so long, and can you confirm that the position will be named by the 12-month mark in August?
Thank you for the question, Devin. And it's a good question. Sometimes things take time. As I said in my remarks, both the mandate and the potential candidates have been the subject of active back and forth between us, between me and my office, and Indigenous leadership, including communities, as well as the national organizations. Sometimes things take time. Sometimes good things take time, and we really want to do this right in order for this person to be able to be as effective as possible. I wish it happened more quickly, but it is what it is, and we've done our best to move as diligently and as effectively as we could under the circumstances.
Okay, I didn't hear a commitment to the 12-month mark in that, but I did have another question for Minister Lametti. Just building on the questions from Stephanie, you received the judge's report for the Wrongful Convictions Commission in November of last year. It's been 6 months since then, and I'm just trying to understand why your government hasn't issued any sort of a response if you're saying that this is a priority.
Again, thank you for that question. As you know, and we've spoken about this before, Devin, this is close to my heart. We received the report. We had it translated. We tabled it in the House of Commons. And we are now dealing with, we're analyzing the various suggestions that are in there. It's a complex report, and it's a complex subject. And again, it's better to do this properly and to get it right, or as right as possible, and that's still going to take some time and effort.
Thank you. We'll go to the next question. It's from Zali Lee from City News. Please go ahead.
Hi, are you hearing me all right?
Yes, but speak slowly,
all right.
please.
This is for Minister either Miller or Hajdu. It's not particularly important. I get that there's some updates on things previously announced in Budget 2022 and 2021, but what precisely is new today? Why was this news conference called?
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think, you know, as we near the 1-year anniversary of the discoveries or rediscoveries in Kamloops, we've been acting and reacting in a way that we are striving to do that we haven't done in the past, which is to take a comprehensive approach as to how we support communities in getting to the truth. Over at least 2 successive inflection points, including Budget 2022 and just immediately prior to last election, we made announcements that have now totaled well over $500 million to support the implementation of calls to action 72 through 76. This is an opportunity to give Canadians and maybe even people who are learning about this the first time a full sense of what's going on around this country. As I mentioned in my remarks in particular, this is an issue that is intimately linked with the colonization of the Americas. It's not limited to Canada, but it's one where we have to focus on our work that we need to do in Canada to help and support Indigenous peoples in their quest to find answers about their loved ones. This comprehensive approach will allow us to work with communities and make sure we do perhaps the one thing that they've asked us not to do, which is reproduce the model. That is to say, how do we ensure that going forward this type of system doesn't reproduce itself as it has in the Child and Family Services, removal of children away from their communities and culture. How do we do this in a way that doesn't reproduce the education model that led to this? So it's about being comprehensive in our approach, investing and focusing our efforts in what communities are telling us to do, and doing it in a way that the Canadian government doesn't usually do things, which is not necessarily the one that has all the answers or all the control of the situation. So you asked if anything's new in this. We're talking about approach, we're talking about scope and depth of multi-department actions, including on behalf of the Minister of Justice, my colleague at Indigenous Services Canada, Patty Hajdu, and about 5 or 6 other ministers that are all working to do something that we haven't done before, which is establish trust, accountability, and move to a place where we don't necessarily know the answer, but we know we need to follow in communities that are going through a pretty devastating time. I don't know if Patty wants to complete my thought, but this is an opportunity. This is really an opportunity to give a quick, imperfect snapshot of what's going on in the country in terms of the continued search for truth at residential schools.
Maybe I can just, I will add on just a few words, because I think Minister Miller's been really comprehensive. It is about a snapshot of what's happened so far. But listen, I think the process of truth is not a one-time announcement. It's not a specific day. It's not a specific investment. The process of coming to a realization for many Canadians last summer that Indigenous children not only were apprehended from homes and placed in residential schools, sometimes hundreds of miles away, and often died in these schools or faced in situations that many of us can't imagine. That was new information for many Canadians. Some of us, through our studies or our relationships, have known about the impact of residential schools as part of colonization for a while, but for some Canadians this was brand new. And so part of our journey as a government, as a country, as nations, is telling each other the truth as we uncover it, mourning and grieving together, and working together to make sure that we have all the supports necessary to reconcile ourselves as a country with these truths, as difficult as they are.
Okay, so I get the newness of the scope and the approach and the seriousness with which the federal government is approaching this issue, but do you get that these continued federal announcements for previously announced funding with no significant updates on what's approaching the 1-year anniversary of Tecumseh, to a cynic, this may appear to be the federal government attempting to get some favorable press ahead of a major milestone?
Well, I think if we've learned anything from this press conference, this isn't about getting favorable press. And it's not about the federal government trying to pat itself on the back. We've made significant investments, yeah. We've made them in now essentially two budgetary cycles. But this is a process of reckoning and giving Canadians a snapshot of what we need to do as a country to be better and move forward in a way that we haven't done as the past. So if anyone thought that we were going to stand here today and look for good press You've totally missed the point, and if that's on me, it's on me. But the point is this. We're working as a government, we're working as the federal government in the imperfect way that we work, to work with Indigenous communities, a number of which are reeling, to get money, support, and funding out into communities for them to help lift up the truth, frankly, because that's a truth that we as a government have denied those communities, and we've been complicit in it. So the point here isn't to stand here and give one shelf or tranche of funding, walk away, pat ourselves on the back, and hope we get a front-page newspaper story out of it. That is not at all what it is. And if it was the intention, we wouldn't have done it in the first place. The point is about showing Canadians that we're trying to put our best foot forward about a painful part of our history that people like me have tried to deny for centuries. So, to answer your question, this is a snapshot. It's an imperfect snapshot. We've told communities we'll be there with them. We're going to be with them to the bitter end to get to the bottom of a very, very painful truth that we've written report about, and we still don't have the full snapshot or picture of. And behind that is an individual who may get some sense of closure by getting a piece of information about a lost one that's been denied to them. So we've got a comprehensive set of strategies within our government to put our best foot forward and to get information out to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Institute in Winnipeg, give them the capacity to get up and running so that people like me aren't making the decision as to who, what, when, and how people get information about their lost ones. And that's going to take some time, and it's going to take money. And if anyone that wants to be in power in my place thinks any differently, they're welcome to try. But reconciliation isn't free. It's going to take investment, and anyone that wants to be in power in the place of the Prime Minister needs to invest at least as much and be relentless in their investments towards Indigenous communities, because as a country, that's the only way we can move forward.
Thank you. We'll now take the next question from the French portion. The next question is from Laurence Martin from Radio-Canada. Please go ahead.
Oui, bonjour. Ma question est pour le ministre Miller. Je m'entends en écho. Je voulais voir avec vous, parce que là, on va avoir une visite royale demain. Attendez, je vais essayer d'enlever l'écho. Oui, donc demain, on va avoir... non, on l'entend encore dans votre système, je suis désolée. C'est très déconcentrant. Donc, demain, le prince Charles et sa femme vont arriver au Canada pour une visite de 3 jours. Je me demandais comment est-ce que la famille royale pourrait-elle aider peut-être concrètement dans ce processus de réconciliation au Canada, peut-être, je ne sais pas, en partageant des documents comme ceux de l'Église anglicane. Allô?
Alors, je ne veux pas inventer la question qui a été posée, mais il me semble que j'ai entendu une question sur la visite royale du prince Charles et l'impact que ça peut avoir sur les communautés en ce qui a trait aux pensionnats autochtones, puis la relation avec laquelle la couronne a avec ces communautés. Évidemment, ça, comme vous le savez, étant journaliste d'expérience sur l'enjeu, ça varie de communauté en communauté. La couronne, dans certains coins du pays, notamment les traités numérotés, ont et privilégient un lien direct avec la couronne. Alors, la présence du prince Charles dans ces communautés est non seulement symbolique, mais très profonde au niveau de la relation avec la couronne et la famille royale. Évidemment, les enjeux que vont soulever les communautés, ce ne sont pas les enjeux sur lesquels je pourrais parler, mais je présume que ça va avoir avec le legs de l'école, la colonisation, le legs des pensionnats autochtones sur les communautés et une importance, encore une fois, de soulever les enjeux auprès de la famille royale et de la couronne. C'est tout ce que j'ai pu comprendre de la question, mais je suis désolé si j'ai mal compris.
Mais en fait, plus précisément, ce que je cherche à comprendre, c'est est-ce que il y a des choses que concrètement la famille royale peut faire pour aider au processus de réconciliation? Je pense peut-être avec des documents qu'elle pourrait partager de l'Église anglicane et Ma deuxième question, c'est est-ce que vous pensez que la reine, en tant que chef de l'Église anglicane, doit s'excuser?
Ben, écoutez, d'abord et avant tout, ce que j'ai pu entendre des communautés autochtones qui, évidemment, ils parlent de bien des choses, mais de la famille royale, c'est pas une conversation qui revient à chaque jour. La présence d'une famille royale, évidemment, ça a l'impact que ça a eu, que ça peut avoir dans une communauté. Évidemment, dans la mesure où la couronne responsable de la colonisation serait demandée à présenter des